Yeah, so thank you guys for joining me today in the session to talk about data preparation for Salesforce. My name is Sam Hoult, and I'm currently I founded a company called DataImporter, and I'll give you a brief introduction about myself. So I have basically spent my entire career in some capacity working with Salesforce. So I started at a company in New Zealand, where I'm originally from, working as an end user of Salesforce in a customer service type role. And that was, I guess, my first experience to Salesforce. My first ever time hearing about it was actually just getting in there and using it. So the company that I was working for had only had Salesforce for about 6 months at the time, so it was still pretty new. We didn't have any in-house admin resources. We'd had a implementation partner come in, kind of build the whole setup for us. This was before Lightning was around, so we're still on the beautiful classic version. And we would kind of just left ourselves to it to kind of manage it on an ongoing basis. And so after working through that customer service type role, I began using Salesforce more and more as on the admin side of things, building reports, building dashboards, adding a new field here and there, until I basically fell into a role as an accidental admin, as I like to call it, where the company essentially created a role for me to focus on that full time, because they just saw the value and the need as the company grew that they needed someone full time in that role. And then from there, I have moved over to Germany, which is where I currently am, and worked for around about 2 years as a consultant with Salesforce, working for a company that did implementations and projects with financial services companies. So some of the biggest banks in Germany and around Europe, insurance companies, wealth management companies, those types. And recently, so just in December last year, publicly launched my company DataImporter.io, which is a product to help companies import their data into Salesforce, also export it out, connect different systems and that kind of thing. So yeah, I've had quite a few different roles and seen different parts of the ecosystem. And throughout all of those things, all of those different roles have had something to do with data. And so the first session that we're going to be running through today is about data preparation and really preparing for a successful implementation or a successful project with Salesforce and data. And so I kind of like to think of it, data migration is a little bit different from other things in Salesforce, like a flow, for example, or a new page layout, in that if you do it well, you normally won't hear anything from the end users. It's kind of the baseline for data migrations is that everything runs smoothly, you get it all right, it's working perfectly. And if you do that most of the time, you won't get any kind of, or from my experience, you won't get too much positive feedback from the end users, because that's just their general expectation, especially if they're coming from an existing system, like if they're working with an SAP or Microsoft Dynamics or something and the data there was working correctly, they're just going to expect that it's automatically working correctly in Salesforce. Whereas if you do something wrong or something goes wrong along the way, it's normally one of the first things that you'll hear about. So if a sales rep goes onto Salesforce after the migration's happened and he can't see some of his contacts, or some of his accounts are assigned to the wrong sales rep, then you'll hear about it pretty quick. So that's just one thing to keep in mind with data migrations, is that they're very, very important for Salesforce. And that's basically my next point, is that without accurate and up-to-date data, Salesforce is kind of useless. Because I've seen some companies before do a big migration project, and then after that, there's no kind of follow-up to that. The users are just left to themselves to maintain the data. There's no follow-up plan. There's no kind of guidance for the users on how they should be maintaining data, and there's no automation set up to maintain that data for them. And so if you think about all of the different processes and projects that you guys would have been building as part of your training, and then obviously going into into jobs, all of them rely on data in Salesforce in one way or another, whether it's building a flow to calculate something, or even just the page layouts that you're going to be setting up. All of them are going to be relying on that data in Salesforce. So it's a pretty important thing to keep a track of. And by the way, I forgot to mention at the start, but if you guys have any questions along the way, feel free to just pop them in the chat or raise your hand, and then I'll come to them when I see them. And then there'll also be plenty of time at the end for questions. And yeah, the final point on why data is important in Salesforce is that every type of role deals with data in some capacity. So if you're an admin setting up, like I said, page layouts, processes, and those kinds of things, having a good understanding of that data is really important. If you're a dev who's going to end up building Apex triggers or any kind of complex workflows or anything like that, you're definitely going to need to understand the data on a pretty deep level. Even end users will need to have some understanding of the data in Salesforce just to know how to navigate through the system, like how different objects relate to each other, how do I click from one object to another, all of those kinds of things, as well as management who are going to be looking at reports and dashboards will need to have some sort of understanding of the data within Salesforce. So it's a pretty fundamental part of the system. And so what's the best way to really understand that data? Because quite often as an admin, you might just get dumped with, hey, here's some data we need imported into Salesforce, go for it kind of thing, which is obviously not the easiest position to be in. So communication is really important. You really want to make sure that the owners of the data you're communicating with, so whether that's a sales rep who's giving you a list of their contacts, whether that is the IT department who's giving you a dump from some sort of database, just get into a really in-depth discussion with them and really make sure that you understand the data, understand what types of data you're receiving, how you'll be receiving it, and all of those kinds of questions. It's really important at the beginning of the process, before that migration kind of is underway, while you're in the preparation phase, that you have lots of clear communication with all of the different people involved in the project to make sure you understand the data. And it's also important to understand where that data comes from as well. Like if it's just a CSV file that's going to be given to you, that will determine how you are then going to be able to import that data. Or if it's something that's stored in like a Google Drive or a OneDrive, that will probably change how you end up handling the migration project as well. So understanding where all of the different data points are coming from is pretty important. I've seen before as well that their sales reps or certain people in the organization might think that one particular data point is really important to them, but it might not be important to the overall project success or for the actual business itself. So it's really important to understand what part of the data that I'm importing or updating is really mission critical. So talking with those end users again, talking with the people who are responsible for the project and understanding what is a nice to have and what do I really need to get in there, because you don't want something that's just a nice to have hold up or delay or kind of throw off the entire migration project. And then just understanding, I guess, the scope and the size of the data is more of a technical question, but that will definitely determine the steps that you'll need to take to get that into Salesforce. For example, if you're dealing with data that has millions of rows, like transaction data or something, then you're not really going to be able to use Excel to do any kind of spot checks because, well, first of all, Excel can only handle up to just over 1 million rows, and your laptop will probably start sounding like a rocket ship about to take off if you try and open it up. So if you've got any kind of real big data sources, then you're going to have to look to another tool, like in a data importing tool, or even some sort of coding like Python or something like that, if you're wanting to do any analysis of some really big data sets. But for anything small, then the standard data loaders, which I'll talk about shortly, will probably be able to meet what you're after. Yeah, and so that gets to the question of deciding which tool is most appropriate. So Salesforce themselves offer a couple data loading tools for you, which are kind of there out of the box, free to use. One of which is the Salesforce data loader, used to be called the Apex data loader, which is a program which you can install onto your computer. So that's, I guess, for some people already a blocker. Some IT departments don't like having a program that needs to be downloaded and installed. And it gives you some real basic functionality to let you import. You can see here you can also export, delete data in and out of Salesforce using CSV files. And for lots of things, this is probably going to be enough for you. You know, if you've got a real basic import that you're doing, there's no kind of cleaning of the data that you need to do. It's just going into one object. There's not too much relational data in there. Then data loader itself is probably the right tool for you. Within Salesforce, so within the interface, there's also the data import wizard, which basically will let you upload up to 50,000 records. And you can, it's kind of like a UI interface, which you can go through step by step and is mainly used for accounts and contacts. So if you've got a list of some contacts with some accounts attached to them, you can use the kind of built-in data import wizard to do that import for you. And I guess it also has the added benefit of not needing to download anything. It's all available from within Salesforce. And then I guess on the other end of the spectrum, the more complex products, one is MuleSoft, which is a company which Salesforce acquired. And they are a platform which is also being integrated more and more within Salesforce, where you can kind of build complex workflows where you can integrate different systems together with Salesforce directly, set up different data sources to be kind of combined together. So for the more complex projects or implementations where you've got lots of different connected systems needing to come in and out of Salesforce, something like a MuleSoft is probably going to be the product that you're going to go for. It obviously comes with an additional cost, and it's not a cheap product. And then on the other tier is a product like mine, which is kind of sits in between the MuleSofts and the data loaders, where you don't have the full complex functionality of a MuleSoft. So you can't do things like combine lots of different data together, lots of complex kind of manipulations of the data, but it has some of the features, like you can clean some data, you can do some lookup relationships without needing the IDs and stuff like that. And it's not the only product out there. There's other ones like it as well. So you kind of have some different tiers of product is how I would describe them. And depending on the data that you're working with, and that's where understanding the data is really important, will help you determine which tool is going to be the best one for you to use. Cool. So once you actually start getting into looking at that data, one thing which I would always recommend is preparing some templates for people. So if you're doing a migration and you're needing end users to give you data, so a pretty common example is, again, I'll use it, the sales reps, they have their contacts just in, I don't know, Outlook contacts or something like that, or each person has their own Excel spreadsheet, right? That's a pretty typical example, as opposed to just saying, okay, everyone, send me your contacts, send me your accounts. What I would suggest doing is providing people a template, and you can often, if you want to get a bit more fancy with it, you can build some validations into the Excel template as well. Otherwise, I would just write a description in the email or however you tell them with how they need to fill this template in. And how that will really help you is, first of all, the headers are going to be consistent across different people. So if you're sending this to 10 different sales reps or 100 different sales reps, and they each have to fill this template in, you know that the data that they send back to you is going to have the same headers, which is going to help you when you actually go to import that data. Because if you just tell them, just send me your contacts, sometimes you're going to get something saying account name, or you're going to get something saying just name, or if it's contacts, you're going to get full name or first name and last name in 2 different columns. And then the onus is then on you to kind of clean that all up, or then you have to go back and forth with the sales reps, and it's just not a good look. So I suggest from the get-go that you really, once you've understood that data and you understand how that needs to go into Salesforce, you provide people templates. You can also do a similar thing for people in an IT department if you're needing someone to extract data from a database or from a different system and send it to you in a CSV file. You can also provide them a template where they can set the column headers as you need to have them. So you can kind of talk with different people in the business and just make your life a little bit easier and take some of the responsibility away from yourself. And then some of those, I guess, slightly more complex tools like Mywant or like a MuleSoft will give you a kind of interface to build your own mappings as well. So there's no real need for you to set up your own template if you're going to use like a data importing tool, because those products come with their own features built in. And then a tip here is practice Excel VLOOKUPs. I kind of tell people to avoid Excel lookups where possible. And when we go into the sessions next week and the week after, I'll give you some practical examples of why that is. But Excel VLOOKUPs, they're easy to make mistakes with. And if you're the one doing them, especially on large data sets, and you make a mistake, it can be really painful and embarrassing, really. Like I made when I was in the kind of accidental admin stage of my career and kind of was responsible for all of these things. That was one of the mistakes that I made, was doing a VLOOKUP, dragging it down. I misclicked somewhere and suddenly the rows were off, lookups weren't working correctly, and things can go wrong. So I would suggest, practicing Excel VLOOKUPs. There's lots of online help, YouTube videos, and just get in there and practice it yourself. But you're probably going to encounter them at some stage of your career. Cool. The next step that you'll want to be thinking out is access to this data. So one of the things to think about is which users should and will have access to the data. And the reason I split that out is because you should, and this is part of the communication, is when you're talking with the people in the project about the data import, some of the questions you should be asking is who should be able to see this data? Is it the owner of the record? Is it everyone who has access to Salesforce? And you can compare that with who currently will have access to that data. So if I do this data import right now, will everyone be able to see this data? And is that correct? Does that match the requirements that I've been given? Do I need to create any new sharing rules? So if you have the default set to private, which means that basically only the owners can see the data, do I need to let more people have access to the data than they currently do? Or on the opposite side of things, if a new feature from Salesforce is these restriction rules, which is basically where if everyone has access to the data, but you're doing an import and you only want a certain profile, for example, or you want a certain profile to not be able to see the data, instead of readjusting all of your sharing rules, you can add a restriction rule to cut people out. So it's kind of the opposite thing. Restriction rules is something where if you search for something in the global search in Salesforce, you can say, okay, anyone who has the profile customer service rep can't see the accounts where the type is business account, for example. And then I guess the last part of that in terms of access is, are there any changes that you're going to need to make to do with the role hierarchy, record types, and the overall access? So if you're creating a new object, for example, part of the process is going to be creating a new record type. And once you create that new record type, you obviously have to grant access to the right people so that they'll be able to see those records once they're imported. And one way that I like to test that, and this is going to be dependent on your org, whether this is allowed or not. But there is a feature called login as, which needs to be enabled within setup. And what that basically lets you do is jump onto a different user. There'll be a little login as button. You can click that, and then you'll be logged into their Salesforce account. You can't see their password or anything like that. And what it lets you do is essentially just go through as an end user using their Salesforce account to test things like, okay, this import that I've just done, I've granted the profile access to the record types. I've made sure that the sharing rules and stuff are all adjusted if I need to. Can this person actually see this data? That's one way to check it, which is obviously important if it's really sensitive data, like if you're uploading employee data or anything that's protected by any kind of law where only certain people should see it, then that's something that you need to be really careful about. Cool. Something which I think is kind of overlooked quite often, and this is something which I overlooked a lot, is you're going to do this import and add some accounts, for example. But what you need to think about is what's going to happen to those accounts once they're in Salesforce. I'm not talking about long-term, because obviously, hopefully the end users will be updating those records and adding notes and stuff like that. But what's going to happen immediately from this import? Do I have any flows that are active on the object? Are there any triggers or process builders or workflow rules that are attached to this object? Because sometimes, and this has happened to me, when I've gone and done an import, I look at the CSV file, it looks all good. I look at the mappings, looks fine to me, do the import. And then I go and look at some records in Salesforce to do some kind of spot checks. And some of the data just looks completely off with what I've imported. And the main reason for that will be because there's some other process in Salesforce which is then going and changing that data. So just being aware and understanding what processes you have in your org that are active is really important in terms of assessing whether the data importing you're doing is correct. And one step which you might need to take is deactivating processes just for the duration of this import. So a common use case might be, okay, every time an opportunity stage is updated, for example, it's going to send an email to the customer as an example. And obviously, if you're doing a bulk update of lots of opportunities, you might want to deactivate this email functionality because otherwise tens of thousands of emails might go out and your customer service team might get overloaded. So just be aware of any bulk processes. It might be the same if you've got a connection to an external service. So if you've got a trigger which sends all your Salesforce data to an external system, there might be limitations on that side as well, where they can only process a certain amount in a certain time period. So it's just got to be aware of what's happening on the Salesforce side of things as well. And then the only other step here, which I would kind of consider the most important, is the order of migration important. And what I mean by that is if I'm uploading some accounts and contacts, normally there's a relationship between those two objects where the contacts will have a lookup relationship to the account. So the contacts belong to the account essentially. And if I go ahead and just upload all the contacts first, and then I upload the accounts, if there are accounts that don't exist in Salesforce and I upload the contacts first, then the relationships will be missed or you might get errors, right? So it's in that case, it would generally be better to upload the accounts first, and then you can upload the contacts so that all of those accounts that you need are going to be there. And it might not just be accounts and contacts, it could be any custom objects that you have, but really just assessing, is there any importance in the order that I do things? If you're just uploading lots of separate data and there's no kind of relationships, then it's probably going to be okay to just kind of upload it in whatever whatever stage you think is necessary, but sometimes it will be important. Leave yourself enough time. I've seen it sometimes, or quite often actually, that the data migration is kind of seen as the last step, that happens just before go live. Oh yeah, we just need to import that data, that'll be fine, right? It kind of just gets swept to the side, like it shouldn't be a big deal. But in my opinion, it is a very important part. And so I would suggest creating a migration timeline. So normally you're going to have some sort of project plan, which is going to include, if you're doing sprints, it might include all the different objects or processes that you're designing, all of the page layouts and that kind of stuff, some testing. Include data migration as like a big piece of that. I would typically try and have it essentially throughout the whole project, you're working on the data migration side of things, because as you're working through different parts of Salesforce, so if you're building a flow, editing page layouts, like I said previously, all of the stuff relies on the data. And if there's a change in a decision, like, okay, we want to use a new field in the flow, and that field needs to be in a certain format, and we're receiving this field in the data migration, it's kind of at that point in time that you need to assess, do I need to update anything in the data migration? Whereas if you just leave that to the end, it's often too late to really do that effectively. So I would suggest kind of, giving yourself plenty of time and communicating that clearly, that we are going to need lots of time for this migration, and it'll let you prepare and test a lot more as well. And then the last thing here is have a cutoff date. And so what I mean by that is, if you're coming, this kind of mostly relies on if you're coming from an existing system. But if you're coming from an existing system where users are constantly updating data, adding new contacts, updating prices or quotes or whatever it might be, at some point in time, you're going to have to say, okay, now is the day where you don't do anything in your old system, because we're going to be performing this migration. And from this day onwards, you're going to be using Salesforce as the source of truth. So typically, and unfortunately for us, this will be done like over a weekend or something like that, because that's generally the only time where people typically aren't working. So you might have a cutoff on, let's just say 5 p.m. on a Friday night, bye-bye to the old system. And if everything goes to plan, on a Monday morning, you'll be coming in and using Salesforce as the only system. But why I say it's important to have a cutoff date is that it's pretty common for users to kind of, if they're brand new to Salesforce, or if they've been doing something in a different way before, to kind of stay on that old way of doing things, because Salesforce is new and it's scary and I don't know how to use it. And if you don't have a fixed cutoff date, then you end up with having some data updated in the old system, some in the new system, and it's just a very messy way to go about things. So that's where just talking with other people in the business and other management teams, to make sure that there's a fixed date that you have, that there's a cutoff between the two systems. There's no go back button. Another pretty important one. So unlike in Excel or some other systems, if you type the wrong thing, you do a spelling mistake, you can just click Control-Z or undo, and it goes back to the way it previously was, right? With data in Salesforce, if you save a record, it's saved. There's no way to undo that apart from going in there and undoing it yourself. So for an end user, it's probably not the biggest deal in the world, right? If they make a spelling mistake, click save, they can just click edit and undo it. But if you're doing an import of 10,000 or 1 million records, or updating lots of things, it is quite important to make sure that you're aware that you can't undo something. And what can you do about that? Well, that's where deciding and understanding the data, choosing the right tool is really important. So if this is something which is a mission critical thing, you need to be able to roll back. You've got a few options. Salesforce has their own solution called Salesforce Backups, which is, it was a previous solution which they said that they were going to stop and have recently brought it back again. And it's basically a way for you to have, I think it's daily or weekly backups of your entire data set. It's a paid additional feature, but it lets you kind of revert back if there's something that's gone wrong. There's lots of third-party apps, like the most popular one is Own Backup, that you can use to back up your Salesforce data as well. And some of the data importing tools, so like my tool as well as MuleSoft, have some kind of rollback functionality as well. So if you're inserting some records and something goes wrong, which it almost certainly will at some point, you can kind of easily undo things as opposed to having to kind of go in and manually do it yourself. But just be aware that there are tools to help you with the go back button, but that doesn't exist in Salesforce. And yes, kind of along those lines is reversing data import can be pretty complex and it can take lots of time, especially if you have like flows and triggers, which are kind of doing things after that import. Figuring out what's going on is kind of nearly impossible. Cool. Yes, build your data model with your data in mind. So it sounds kind of straightforward or logical that you build, the Salesforce objects, how your data is structured, but quite often it actually works the opposite way. People will build up Salesforce how they want it to be, and then try and fit and twist their data to work into that, which is a really difficult way of doing things because you end up changing how the data is and forcing people to give you data in a way that it really shouldn't be. So some kind of just general tips that I suggest to people is use the standard objects where they're appropriate. So don't go ahead and make custom objects for every single thing, even if the name of the object doesn't fit your purpose. Like for some people, accounts isn't the right name for their customers because they don't call them accounts. They might call them car dealerships or whatever it is, but don't go ahead and make a car dealerships object just for the sake of it. You can always rename the standard objects as well. And they have there's some features and functionality which are kind of built into those standard objects for a reason, right? So use them where you can. Think about what relationships you need. So the typical one is accounts and contacts. That's pretty straightforward. But between all of your different objects that you're going to have, what relationships are essential for the end user to kind of make their way through Salesforce without having to do too much searching? And are those relationships actually available in the data that you have, right? So again, this is another thing which I see companies try and force is I need this object connected to this object. But in the data that they have, there is no connection, right? They kind of want that to magically happen or that to be built up within Salesforce itself. And those things get very, very complex and they can be done. But I would say try and rely on the data that you're given and make sure that if there's any relationships or complexities that are needing to be built, that those actually exist in the data. And then finally is think about what is the best way to display the mission critical data. So as an end user of Salesforce, when I was in a customer service role, so I was basically in an inbound team where we're just, call comes in, hang up, next call comes in, hang up over and over again. You need to have the right information in front of you to be able to deal with those calls quickly, right? And so making sure that you can display that mission critical data to the users is really important. So what I typically like to do is each object has this highlights panel that you can add at the top of the page, and you want to be displaying the kind of most important, but also accurate and up-to-date information in that highlights panel. So you're going to have kind of 4 to 5 key fields or attributes about each object, and you want to make sure that those are being shown up the top, so that as soon as someone comes onto that, they're able to see the right information. Cool. You want to be tracking what you're doing as well, right? It's very easy when you're doing imports or updates or whatever it might be to kind of just do it. Yep, it worked. Go on to the next one, do it. Oh, this didn't work. Okay, I'll go fix that. Here's another job. Here's another job. And then it becomes very hard to kind of break down and understand really what you've done. So there's some tips that you can kind of do from outside and within Salesforce just to make sure that you're really tracking and also covering yourself so that you have a clear kind of audit trail. This is what I've done. You can see it from within Salesforce or from outside Salesforce. Here's the CSV files of everything that's happened and go through it like that. So one thing is obviously history tracking from within the objects themselves. So on each object, you can basically set it up so that certain fields will be tracked whenever they're updated. And that will just let you, if you're updating those records, doing a bulk import, then that will be recorded within Salesforce. Okay, Sam at this time on this day updated this field from this value to that value. So then if if you get a complaint from an end user or from someone else that the data you imported was wrong or you've screwed something up, you have a kind of audit trail from within Salesforce. You can easily add in a related list onto the object to say, hey, look, you can see exactly what's happened here. There's also a feature from within Salesforce called Create Audit Fields. And what that is basically, I might share or have a look at the Salesforce screen here. If I log myself back in. So if you're importing brand new records, right? So let's just say I have this account here, which I'm importing, and it's coming from an existing system or it's coming from an end user. And I want to have some, typically when you do those imports, you'll see these fields down the bottom here, created by and last modified by. They're just updated automatically by Salesforce, right? So anytime anyone comes in and clicks edit, they click save, these records are updated automatically. There is actually a feature from within Salesforce, which you can enable, and that will let you manually set these values when you're inserting data. And where that can be quite important is if you have, like I said, existing database or some source of data, and you want to keep those values, what dates and times the accounts or contacts or whatever it is were created in those systems, you can actually insert those dates in here as well. It's not available for updating records. So if you're just updating records, you can't do this, but for inserting new records, you can actually manually set these dates as well. And one thing just to be mindful of is, again, if there's any flows or processes which are active, if you insert these dates and then a flow updates a field value here, that date is just going to be set overridden by the flow itself. But it's a good way of, like typically I have done it for the created date before to say, these accounts were actually created back in 2000, whenever, by whoever as well. So you can set up who they were created by. Cool. Errors will happen, right? It's a pretty common thing. It could either be because we've forgotten some step in the process, we've forgotten to enable a pick list value, or there's a validation rule which I forgot about, or the data that I've been given is dirty, right? The format doesn't fit how it needs to be in Salesforce. That's fine. What I would suggest is don't stop the process. So don't stop your importing process unless it's for like a mission critical thing and everything's broken. If you get the odd error here and there, what I would generally suggest is to continue your process, record the errors that are happening. And so if you're using the standard Salesforce data loader, you'll get an error CSV file, so you can easily see which records didn't work. And at the end of the process, or at a certain stage of the process, you can then analyze why those records failed and kind of adjust it for there. But unless it's something mission critical, I would tend to suggest not to stop the whole process, because you can get caught up on, you can stop the whole process basically because a user or a system gave you dirty data. And if you've got a lot of other data that's kind of needing to be imported, then I would suggest just continue on with that. But that will just be, I guess, a judgment call that you'll have to make along the process. And then finally, another thing which is pretty obvious, but have someone else validate the data for you as well. It's quite easy to get, I guess, caught up in it when you're looking at a CSV file, staring at it for days on end, and you think it looks all right, and then goes into Salesforce, it still looks right, and you just haven't noticed that there's a spelling mistake in something that you've done, right? Just because you've been staring at the screen for the whole day. So just have someone else validate that data for you as well. It never hurts to have a second opinion. It's not like with like doing a deployment of a change set where you can easily kind of, or where Salesforce will run those tests for you to see if there's any obvious errors. With data imports, you're kind of left to your own devices in terms of checking for errors. And even though it might pass in Salesforce, right? If there's like Salesforce isn't generally going to detect a spelling error if it's in a text field or an email, but we can, right? If we have a look at it. So just make sure that you're getting some eyes on the data as well. Cool. So to kind of summarize what we've gone through so far is plan and test just like any other change in Salesforce. So if you're building a new flow, for example, right, you'll typically do that in a sandbox. You'll run some tests there. You might then deploy it to a staging environment or a test environment, test it there before it actually goes into production. And I recommend 100% doing the same thing for data as well. Semi-unfortunately, or maybe not unfortunately, but you can do data importing with no testing whatsoever directly into production, right? And there's a reason why Salesforce doesn't let that happen for triggers and things like that, because things can go wrong pretty quickly. But with data imports, as long as someone has the rights to do it, then they can kind of update all the data that they want. But I would always suggest doing things in the sandbox first. You've got access to sandboxes for a reason. You can sync those sandboxes if they're partial or copy sandboxes to make sure that they have up-to-date production data and the right validation rules and flows and stuff like that, and then test your uploads in a testing environment. Think about backup strategies to protect yourself and the business. So if you're going to be doing a big import and it's a really critical data which will impact the customers directly, have a backup strategy, whether that's a backup tool that you're paying for, whether that is just doing a dump of all of your Salesforce data for yourself. It's really important that you have your own backup strategies, because in the end, if you're the one doing it, at least some of the responsibility will come down to yourself. So yeah, try and come up with your own backup strategies if the company themselves don't have one. Communicate clearly with all the different people who are involved in the migration to establish a realistic plan. Again, don't agree to just do everything on the last weekend, because something's bound to go wrong. And if there's no data in Salesforce on the Monday morning when people come in, then they're not going to be too happy about it. And even if the rest of the project has gone fine, again, data is the kind of thing where it's just expected that it's going to be there and working. And if it's not, then you'll hear about it. And the last thing is just have someone validate that data. Just get some eyes on it before it goes live, because like I said, when you're staring at a screen 24/7, it's often easy to kind of look over or miss some simple mistakes which you've made. Cool. And that kind of wraps up the first session here around data preparation. I see there's been some questions already in the chat, so I'll just quickly run through some of those. Do you have any other tips besides VLOOKUPs for Excel? Yes, I would recommend there's another kind of way of doing VLOOKUPs as well, which is called index match. So there's two formulas called index and one called match. And you can kind of achieve the same as a Excel VLOOKUP, but it gives you a bit more flexibility. So I tend to use index matches where possible. In the end, it should get you the same result as a VLOOKUP. It's just another way of going about things. And then another thing would be, like I mentioned, if you're preparing those templates for people, that you have a look at validation as well. You can do things, you can do some pretty complex things really in Excel. You can say, okay, I have this, I've given the end users this template and they have to fill in the email field. I'm going to validate that it has to have the @ sign, it has to have a full stop in there, it has to be more than 5 characters or whatever it is, right? You can kind of come up with your own things. So I'd say that for data preparation, those two are probably the biggest ones. Cool, yeah, restriction rules, yeah. So that's, yeah, something brand new to Salesforce. I think it was in the latest release or maybe one release ago. They don't work quite the same as sharing rules. I kind of like to think of them as like sharing rules kind of tell you what data they can access, and then restriction rules just cut that off at some point. So it's like taking a slice off the data. But they are really helpful because typically before you would end up with these really, really complex, long sharing rules to say this person can see this, but can't see this, can see this, but can't see this. And if you have a pretty open model and just something you want to cut off, a restriction rule is a pretty easy way of doing that. Create audit fields. Where do we find that? That is a good question. Let's see if I can see this here. It could enable create audit fields. It's in the user interface, that's right. So if I can jump in, let's have a look if we can see it in here. So if I search user interface, click on that down the bottom, this is the page where they just have a big list of settings with lots of checkboxes. And it's this one down the bottom here. Enable set audit fields upon record creation and update records with inactive owners. So what this means, this is actually 2-in-1. Why it's 2-in-1, I don't know, but it is. Update records with inactive owners is another permission which you might have to actually run into in a data migration. Typically, if you have data in Salesforce and the owner of it is now an inactive user, you won't be able to actually update that record, right? So this, you'll get a warning saying you can't update this record because the owner is inactive or something to that effect. Whereas if you enable this, it'll actually allow those updates and not force you to change the owner. Cool. What is the biggest data set that I've imported and how long did it take? Well, at one of the banks I was working for as a consultant, they connected, so they were a retail bank in Germany. Well, it's a global bank, but we were working with the German division. And they were essentially importing all of their customers, cards, current accounts, all of their financial products, as well as all of their transactions every single day into Salesforce. So it was in the tens of millions every single day that were being imported. And how long did it take? It was taking something like 5 to 6 hours every single night. That wasn't just because of the data import itself. It was because they also had a lot of triggers and flows on the Salesforce side of thing as well. And that actually slows down the import by a lot. So if you don't have any triggers or anything that happens on the Salesforce side and you just do an import, it's actually pretty fast to go through the data. You can actually choose which Salesforce has lots of different APIs. And one of them is called a bulk API, where you can, and it's designed to process bulk data loads. And that's actually pretty fast for like even millions of records. But as soon as you start adding any kind of processing on the Salesforce side of things, basically each it splits the data into little batches. Typically it's 200. And each time those 200 records are processed, it's running all of those triggers, flows, workflow rules, all of those things on those 200 records. So I think without the processing side, it probably would have taken about an hour to process the data. But with all of the stuff that was happening within Salesforce, which was needed by the company, it was ending up being 5 or 6 hours. Yep. Data importer checks for duplicates. Yes. So that's another thing which we'll talk about in the next session, which is around data cleanliness. But yeah, so some of the tools will check for duplicates for you before you actually do them. And yeah, I would recommend doing that as well as setting up duplicate rules within Salesforce itself. So you kind of have a two-step process. You can catch duplicates before they actually get into the import stage, and you can prevent duplicates from being created from within Salesforce itself. Cool. Is there any other questions that anyone has at the moment?
This was great. I also wanted to add, this is from experience, be careful with Community and Experience Cloud. There's a button to send out emails to new users, so you may or may not want to turn that off. I may or may have not forgot to unselect that at one point.
Yep. Yeah, the email notifications one is a pretty typical thing to go wrong. Yeah, anytime bulk emails go up, they shouldn't be. It causes lots of headaches for everyone. Yep. So that's something to watch out for.
Are there any other gotchas like that?
There's a lot around things like record ownership. So like when you do an import, Salesforce will set a lot of things by default for you, such as like record ownership. If there's any fields that have default values set, they'll be set for you. And so that even though things can go wrong, you sometimes won't actually get error messages back from Salesforce. So in the third session, we're actually talking about the actual migration step itself. I'll run through some of those examples and show some things where even though you might not get told it's an error and you might look in Salesforce and it looks okay to you, some things can actually still go wrong. Yeah, and I saw another question around the weekly backups that Salesforce offers by default. Yeah, so Salesforce can email you basically a zip file with all of your data once a week. And you can use it as a backup. I know companies that do use it as a backup. So there's definitely nothing stopping you from using it as a backup. I probably wouldn't suggest it just because you just get that backup as CSV files essentially. And so if something goes wrong, then the onus is on you to then redo all of those jobs and import the data again, which can be pretty complex and take lots of time. And then it's already delayed, right? As soon as so let's say you decide, okay, today something's gone wrong and I want to use the backup from last week, right? What do you do about the data that's been updated today? Because that wasn't in the backup that was there on Friday. And there's those kinds of things to think about as well. So you definitely can use it, but yeah, I probably wouldn't suggest it for most companies.
Sam, we'll be back the next 2 weeks. This is part 1 of a 3-part series. So if you think of anything, you can always ask next week.
Yeah. Yeah, you can feel free to add me on LinkedIn or just send me an email. sam@dataimporter.io. Be happy to answer any questions you have. But yeah, so next week's session will be about data cleanliness. So I'll be showing some examples of things you can do actually within Excel itself. And then on the Salesforce side of things, some things you can do for data cleanliness. And then the final session will be about migration. So running through some practical examples of importing data and some things to be careful of.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam. Thank you guys for showing up in the US, it's a holiday today. So
yeah, true. Thank you guys for showing up, especially this early in the morning.
Yeah, appreciate it all. All right, guys, have a good rest of your day.
Cool. See you guys later.